Good afternoon, everyone. We're certainly not only in the home stretch, but bringing it to a close this afternoon, with this being the last session of our wonderful summit. Have you had a good time so far? Have you learned a lot? Yeah, liven up the crowd a little bit. Great. It's nothing like ending the day talking about contracts. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me thank our summit sponsors who are listed in the program. The summit will not be possible without their support. This session is approved for continuing legal education credits. Attorneys should have received a CLE form at check-in. Planners, landscape architects, and LEED professionals may also receive credit. Please see the continuing education table in the foyer for information. Now that we're done with that commercial, my name is Preston Castile. I am the president and CEO of Helix Community Schools, and I'm past chair of the board for CPEX. Our presentation today is on community benefit agreements. CBAs are crucial tools for ensuring that a community derives appropriate levels and kinds of benefits from development projects happening in their backyards. These agreements are a feature of community benefit plans, which are required for federal funding under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Louisiana does not have a well-established practice for CBAs, so we need to develop a sustainable CBA process to ensure that Louisiana can compete for federal funding and that communities benefit equitably from industrial development. We have a fantastic group of panelists. Wave panelists to the audience. They're happy, they're excited to be here. First, we have Spring Gaines. Spring is the Research and Policy Manager at CPEX, developing and supporting policy initiatives designed to help Louisiana plan for a climate-resilient energy future that drives equity and economic opportunity in our state. And next, we have Matilda Kreider. Matilda Kreider is a researcher on the wind energy stakeholder engagement and outreach team at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where she conducts research and engagement related to the social, equity, and policy and planning aspects of offshore and land-based wind energy. She currently leads NREL's research on community benefit agreements, studying the impacts they have on wind development and identifying trends in how community benefits are used on the national scale. And last but not least, we will have Max Jabrixio. Max currently operates Max Engagement, a consulting firm providing training and strategic advice on effective community engagement to clean energy companies, advocates, and allies. Prior to founding Max Engagement, he served as Director of Public Engagement for Apex Clean Energy, where he led local engagement campaigns leading to the successful permitting of over 1 gigawatt of wind and solar. I will now turn the panel presentation over to Spring. Spring, you're up.
Thank you, Preston, introduction. I'm happy I did not trip going down those stairs, so victory number one. All right, folks, I actually want to start with a couple of questions for you. When you came into the room today, have you heard the term community benefit agreement before? Raise your hand. Excellent. How many of you know what a CBA actually is? Also really good. And better than me, because this question is what I've been asking myself since I first started at CPEX, and I still don't have an answer. It may be the academic in me, but when you look for a definition for community benefit or benefits agreement, the definition actually comes depending on what source material you are using. You see, like everybody has a different definition. Now, those definitions do have a couple of things in common, but the issue is that the language changes based on who your source information is, who you're asking, what your audience is, and what those benefits might be. So, as Kerr said in energy policy, different language is being used to describe the same thing because messages are intended for different audiences. Now, the definition we might have here today could be vastly different than when you have a different CBA conversation next week, next month, or next year. So let's have some ground rules on what a CBA is based on what we have in common between these definitions. Now, the thing you might see first is agreement or possibly a contract for those attorneys in the room. Something that's legally binding and enforceable is something we're looking for. It's an economic empowerment mechanism, empowering our communities. Now, the definition of community could be a stakeholder group, it could be a community leader, it could be a coalition of communities all coming together for the same purpose. And then we have a developer, somebody who's in charge of a project. So all three of these groups, plus government authorities, become the collaborators for a community benefit agreement. Now, usually when we have the definition of a CBA, it's just the developer and the community involved. Where does government come in with that? There may be some changes to maybe zoning or allotment you only can do with government officials. So we say that all three are collaborators within the process of a CBA. And to make sure that we all have the same vision, there's a few questions you need to consider when developing a CBA, which makes it difficult in the planning process. Because when you're a planner for a community or a development or a municipality, you have certain concerns for your land development, for your land use, what's happening in your community. But these are some base questions you can all ask. Who's receiving the benefits? What are the benefits provided? And what are the perceived impacts? Where are those benefits going? Are those benefits with community plans? Are communities actually involved in the process? We have all that together, we can create viable, enforceable CBAs that have our communities in the process for the best help possible for those communities. Now, I'm going to take you back in time for a second to talk about where CBAs actually came from. It's actually a tale of two stories, depending on where you're looking at it. So the first CBA was actually back in 1998. So they've actually been around for a lot longer than some people think. So on your left, you see Hollywood and Highland. Now, some of you might see this think that looks kind of familiar. There is a theater at Hollywood and Highland that's home to a certain award ceremony called the Oscars. So that theater with 4,000 seats was part of the very first CBA back in 1998. Now, when that was being established, it's also a shopping center and some local community things, but the community thought there'd be a lot more traffic and a lot more crime involved. So how can we receive benefits from this project that's going to potentially hurt us? So as the process was going through, there were some changes in laws around the area to decrease traffic flow, to ensure there's more policing in the area for those who are coming in, and to make sure there's first source hiring for people, which means that hiring was coming from your low income and disadvantaged communities. Also, guess what? Living wage. What about that? Now, that was the first CBA, but the first commonly known CBA was in 2001 with the Staples Center. Once again, we're in LA. So the Staples Center is known as the first commercially viable CBA because that's where the rest of the CBAs come from as far as format. With the Staples Center, the real focus was on affordable housing for communities surrounding the establishment. But they also talked about childcare. How about that? And once again, living wage and first source hiring. Since then, we've seen CBA spread across the country, not just in California and LA where it first started. We have like the Bay Area and San Diego and things like that. But we started going east. So we have it in Milwaukee, we have it in DC, we have it in Florida. And guess what? We have them in New Orleans. Did anybody else know that we have CBAs in New Orleans? I see some nodding heads. Good job, guys. But what I'm going to do right now is give you a couple of examples of CBAs from other places in the country. And some of these may look a bit familiar. So the first one we're talking about is in Nashville, Tennessee, back in 2018. Now, this was actually a stadium that was built for soccer. And some great things that came out of this soccer stadium was that the community had affordable housing options, they had living wages, they had hiring practices and childcare, But they had to have some rezoning happening to make that possible. So the community and the developer got together, figured out what that rezoning looked like, and went to the government together. So it's a great, so talking about that shared vision of what a CBA could look like, this is a great example of what happened. There was actually a large coalition involved. It's called Stand Up Nashville. If anybody's like curious about that, it's actually pretty cool. Now the one on your right, thumbs up. Yeah, anybody recognize that sign? Who would have thought that Facebook had a CBA? So this is out of Palo Alto, California, back in 2016. Facebook wanted to expand their office space, but to do that, they needed to ensure there was a fund for affordable housing. It was actually about $80,000 they contributed towards affordable housing during the CBA. They also had policy enforcement and policy advocacy and legal tender for tenants. So they're trying to enforce that housing policy that's enforceable with their CBA. Now, closer to home is our very own land-based casino, Harrah's. Now, what's interesting about this particular CBA is that it started during the construction process. When Cyrus was first being constructed, they actually went into the community and the community development plan. They found who are the construction workers, who can do manufacturing, who can do operations, what is the population structure, who has the skills and the assets, how can we make sure that local workers are working inside this casino and are involved in every step of the process. And that's exactly what happened. So we have a living wage in a state, a right to work state, that ensures that your low income and marginalized communities have a job, which I think is pretty fantastic. So I was mentioning a couple of dates to you. In the past 3 years, I've actually been seeing a bit of a shift in trend, because some of the things you've been hearing, affordable housing, living wages, childcare, are hallmarks of community benefit programs. But the trend is now going towards development and clean energy. The narrative is shifting, because some of the things we can do offshore are not the same as what we can do onshore. So you might see some different benefit packages happening with clean energy development. So we're seeing it in wind, we're seeing it in solar, we're seeing it in electronic vehicles. And to talk about how that narrative is shifting, I'm going to pass it over to our next panelist.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone so much. I am going to talk a little bit about the role of community benefits in wind energy development specifically. And I do work on land-based wind, but I'll mostly focus on offshore wind, since I know that is probably more the interest for Louisiana. So starting with why consider community benefits right now, and Spring lined that up quite nicely. But I will say that it's an emerging practice in the United States in renewable energy development specifically. There's a much longer history in Europe of using community benefit agreements and funds for wind development in Europe. But we're starting to see it now play a more increasingly significant role in offshore wind energy development than it has in some other renewables in the US. We're also seeing connections made to equity and energy justice, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those connections later in this presentation. And we're seeing growing interest and support from community members and federal, state, local, and tribal governments. And one thing I will say is with offshore wind, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that handles the leasing process for offshore energy, including oil and gas, in its California offshore wind lease auction included a bidding credit for community benefit agreements, but they didn't do that with their Gulf of Mexico leasing auction or some other ones they've held since then. So it's a little unclear what the path forward for federal action on this is, but I did want to give that context. So like Spring said, there's a ton of different definitions out there for this concept. Everybody kind of has their own, and my approach to that has been kind of to think that that's okay, as long as we know what the other person's talking about right when we're talking to them. So I'm gonna just say what my definition is and the definition we use at the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is an agreement fund or other mechanism voluntarily used by a developer to provide additional financial or non-financial benefits to a community. And there's 3 principles that we consider to be pretty important to this definition. The first is that it should be intended to be shared by as much of the community as possible. Obviously, not every benefit will be in line with what everybody wants, but that should be your intention. It should be local. There are some examples of state or regional community benefits coming out, but the goal should be to locally benefit the communities most impacted by the infrastructure. And then it should be additional, so on top of any property taxes, sales taxes, or tax abatements that are kind of already going on. And just one example of how people kind of different definitions, Spring did say that they should be legally binding agreements, but we have been kind of seeing them fall into different forms. And so we've broadened our bucket to include, what everybody normally thinks of, which is that formal agreement between a developer and then local government, tribal government, or community organization. But we also are seeing community benefit funds, which are a fund established by the developer that just distributes funds over time. Direct investment in local priorities or programs, so financial or non-financial support to local causes directly, and then non-financial benefits. That can be everything from expanding internet access, workforce development, building school facilities. It can kind of run the gamut of a lot of different things. And I should say that those aren't mutually exclusive. You might see a CBA agreement that has a fund within it, but it is kind of helpful to know some of the forms that they can come in. There's a lot of different ways that they can vary and that you can customize it to what would meet your community needs. So with financial benefits, this is kind of what makes the news, is the variation in the amount of financial investment. There's also variation in the method of distributing the funds, whether it's that direct payment to the government or whether it's a community fund that community members can apply for. With non-financial benefits, the main variation is the purpose or the target. So whether it's educational, environmental, different causes within the community. But then between both of these, there's variations in who makes decisions about the benefits, whether it's your local government or a committee of community members or the developer. The timelines for distributing funds, whether it's one time at the beginning of project construction or annually over its lifetime. And then who or what receives the benefits would be another variation as well. And this can allow you to customize, like I said, for what the community would like, which I think can be a real benefit. If you're a community that really likes to make collaborative decisions together, you might not like the developer just bringing you a package and saying, here, sign this. So being able to change who makes decisions about it and customize that part of the process can be really effective and beneficial for everyone. Now, there are a ton of acronyms flying around, and being the federal government person on this panel, I've taken it upon myself to try to explain how some of these things fit together. So community benefit plans are a specific, actionable, measurable plan, and this is required for certain Department of Energy funding opportunities. These are attached to the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This was established within the last year, so it's a new requirement. And it's really not interchangeable with the community benefit agreement, even though they do sound quite similar. But a CBA is something that you could propose or include within that plan. And community benefit plans have 4 core areas that you're supposed to mention when you're applying for this funding. The first is Justice 40, which is the Biden administration's policy of trying to have 40% of the benefits of certain infrastructure investments flow to disadvantaged communities, and they define that in a more specific way. But it's in a lot of areas, but 3 of them are housing, clean energy, and pollution reduction. I think transit is another one. There's quality jobs provisions, so prevailing wage, safety, family sustaining wages. In your proposal, you should talk about what action you're taking would create quality jobs. Diverse hiring and training, so things like providing support services like childcare and transportation, recruiting specifically from marginalized populations, pre-apprenticeships and other forms of training that help people enter into the industry. And then the last one is engaging communities in labor. So this is where it covers things like equitable engagement, project labor agreements, and I'll talk about those a bit as well, and then community benefit agreements. So while a community benefit agreement could fall under this plan, it also might not, and that's why we can't say that community benefit agreements are required for this funding. But you are required to fill out this plan. They're being pretty stringent about making sure people are doing a good job of that and evaluating it and really making sure they're making strong commitments that they will actually stick with. So it is a really cool new part of Department of Energy funding. Now with ITEP, I'm sure this is something every person in this room besides me knows a lot more about, so I'm going to only talk about it very briefly, being not from Louisiana. From talks with friends from Louisiana, I've heard there's a lot of opinions about it. So this is an 80% property tax abatement for up to 10 years on manufacturers' investment and capitalized additions in Louisiana. It does have some requirements for companies to document certain workforce commitments. But other than that, I would say it's pretty unrelated to a CBA because I consider those to be separate from taxation and tax abatements. Some would probably argue that this is really a way of letting companies get out of giving certain benefits to communities, and so a CBA is kind of the opposite of that. But I think that does mean that they could be paired well together, potentially, if a manufacturer was to form a CBA with the community instead of the property taxes they would have given without this program. And then my last acronym comparison is Project Labor Agreement. This is a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement between a developer and then labor unions. And this establishes the terms and conditions of employment for a specific construction project. This is specific to construction, so it's really only construction unions that can engage in these, not like other types of unions, so it is limited in that way. But it establishes wage rates, addresses worker health and safety, and you can include things like local hiring of minorities, women, and veterans, pre-apprenticeships and trainings, and other ways of kind of bolstering those provisions. But I do consider these to be rather different, and maybe I'm just too close to the issue, and that's why I think that. But because a PLA is signed with a union and not with the community, it's very different. It's focused on the construction of that project and not the operations or anything else. And it's very beneficial for those workers, but they are not the entire community. They may not be from the host community, so they are rather different to me. Now, I'll only talk about this briefly since there is not a huge land-based wind market in Louisiana, and I don't know that there will be anytime soon. But just for comparison's sake, we've looked at 800 land-based wind projects across the country and found 266 that had community benefits. The vast majority of these were contributions to local organizations and causes, and it's not always pennies. Sometimes it's $50,000, $100,000, but the way they're doing it is directly contributing as opposed to signing a community benefit agreement with the community. But Max is going to talk about that a little bit more. With offshore wind energy, I've broken it up into 3 different categories, again, for comparison. For the project itself, so really not related to onshore infrastructure, really just the offshore project, we've seen 6 agreements. These have included community benefit funds, grid and resiliency infrastructure upgrades, ratepayer relief, expanded internet access, environmental research, so really a number of things. And 2 of those were with tribes. Those were recently signed, so I wanted to highlight that. With cable landings, and this is where the power cables, the subsea cables come on shore from these projects, we've seen 5 agreements, and this is kind of the show me the money category of infrastructure, because this is by far the biggest CBAs we've seen in wind energy, ranging from 16 million to 170 million. The really big one was 240 million, but the community actually turned that down, so that one does not get included. I have lots of thoughts about that. And then the last category is ports. And we've seen 3 agreements and some more that are in progress. These have had host community payments, local workforce training, hiring and business development, a climate adaptation fund, offshore wind education, making the port be lower emissions through certain technology choices, so really a number of things. And I'm going to talk about one of them specifically, I think because in Louisiana, I know that things like workforce development and ports and supply chain are going to be really relevant with offshore wind. The Salem offshore wind terminal in Massachusetts, the CBA was signed a few months ago, includes things like electrification and shore power technologies to reduce some of the air emissions impacts of the port, climate adaptation funds, to targeted hiring for marginalized populations, education, just a really number of things. And then I wanted to highlight that they also had reimbursement for the city for the legal expenses incurred in CBA negotiations, which is huge, and then money for monitoring and compliance over time, which is also really important. Now, to talk a bit about how community benefits, we're seeing them relate to the project's outcomes, because I know that's a big question for lots of folks, planners, communities, developers, everyone. Unfortunately, we don't really know the answer. From the European research, the impact on communities' acceptance of projects and the project's success is uncertain. It can often be perceived by communities as a bribe and actually make them more opposed to the project than they were before. For example, things like the timing and the structure and content of the agreements, who's involved in the decision-making, all of that impacts how people feel about it. If you offer the community benefit agreement after significant opposition has been voiced, it is more likely it will be viewed as a bribe. That kind of just makes sense. And the example I'll highlight on the side there is this was a community that didn't turn down a $240 million, but they turned down several tens of millions of dollars saying that the city can't be bought in relation to an offshore wind cable landing coming onshore. So next question is, should benefits be proportional to the level and type of impact? And the traditional assumption was that compensation was given in response to a negative impact that can't be avoided. But we're seeing offshore wind see much larger financial benefits offered than either land-based wind or offshore oil and gas have. And I would argue offshore wind does not have any significant benefit that those two things do, or sorry, not benefit, negative impact that those other energy industries do not. So we're starting to wonder why we're seeing such unprecedented dollar amounts and what's driving those offers. which brings me to the question of equity and how do community benefits relate to equity. So they definitely have the potential to create equitable outcomes. It's one of the main reasons that the federal government and state governments are really interested in pursuing them. You're sharing benefits with and across the community, which is obviously an element of energy justice. If you have an equitable decision-making process that has everyone at the table equally, you can make sure that things are directed toward disadvantaged communities or community members, which is important. But I would also argue they have the potential to create or reinforce inequities if the decision-making processes don't represent everyone fairly. If some communities have more ability to advocate for themselves because of wealth or capacity or other benefits or other qualities that they have, we'll start to see inequitable distribution of benefits between and within communities because the developers are going to view them as a bigger source of opposition and ability to block the project, and so they're going to give them more money in the developer's eyes. That's kind of how it goes. One example on the side here is for the same project, South Fork Wind, which is the first offshore wind project in federal waters, was started operating this year, which is really exciting. But the community that hosts the port, which is in New London, Connecticut, a very disadvantaged city in the state where I'm from, received a much smaller CBA, and they had to really fight tooth and nail to get it, compared to the community on Long Island and the Hamptons that hosted the cable landing for the same project, same developer, and got about more than 3 times as much money. Thanks. So the key takeaways, we currently have no standard or typical definition, form, or process for community benefits in the United States, which I'm sure as planners probably drives all of you crazy. And for me, trying to research and come up with some federal standards surrounding it is also driving me crazy. But that is just one thing to consider, and maybe we can start to reach some of those, at least within the renewable energy sphere soon. They have complicated relationships with key outcomes in wind energy deployment. We don't actually know if they make projects more successful, communities happier with the project, things more equitable, so it almost looks like, why are we doing this? But we know they're of growing importance to many developers, governments, and communities, and so it's worth considering how to understand them better and understand those impacts better, which is the goal of the research that I do. And I know this was probably not many of you in this room because I know wind energy is not a hugely established industry in the state, but we are setting up a wind energy equity community of practice that is intended to bring together practitioners and researchers doing work related to this topic to share knowledge and kind of align on things better and identify gaps. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me. It is specific to wind energy, but if you're just interested in community benefits in renewable energy and development, I'd love to talk to you as well. And Max is already part of this as well. So love to have everyone. Yeah, thank you.
Is it okay if I step out from behind the podium a little bit? I used to perform in the New Orleans Shakespeare Festival, so you said I need to bring you up. Okay. I was gonna say I've done much larger rooms without a microphone, but if you needed to pick up for the audio, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay. Hi everybody, I'm Max Trabixio. Really excited to talk to you about this. So you've heard a lot about community benefits, and probably at this point, hopefully, are thinking those sound really great. How do we get one? So I'm going to talk a little bit about process and about an experiment that I am working on and hopefully piloting with Center for Planning Excellence and with several other similar organizations in other states around the country. So for my background, I worked in nonprofit community organizing for a long time, doing really grassroots, helping volunteers come up with their vision and their policy priorities and then go advocate for them. And then I worked for a renewable energy developer. So I've been on both sides of the table for this type of conversation for a long time. I've seen a lot of the ways that this can go wrong and can be really difficult. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges and the barriers that there are to getting this done. Then I'm going to talk about our pilot projects and this idealistic model of what I think could be a really good way to hopefully get to some of the positive outcomes that Matilda talked about and that could be here. But I do also want to be realistic with these barriers and challenges that that's not easy. There are some real difficulties inherent in making these work, and you can have a great process, but unless you have really good implementation and some political courage, you still may not get to the outcomes that you want to. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of an overview of how this works. I'm talking about this in the context mostly of land-based solar because that's a ton of the work that I've done, but a lot of this could be applicable to any other type of development that's coming to your community if that's the context that you're working in. So when development starts, A project developer might have identified a site that's appropriate. In the context of solar, that means we found a place that there's good transmission, there's a good solar resource, there's probably wide open agricultural land that we know is potentially going to be buildable, hopefully no wetlands or floodplains. So we've identified all of these things that make this a suitable site for a utility scale solar project that's going to provide enough power for tens of thousands of homes. Then, having found all of that on a map, done a bunch of desktop research, we're going to show up and start talking to people in the community and see if there's actually a real project here. And so that'll involve leasing land from landowners and from the people who would be hosting solar panels on their property. And it's also going to involve talking to parish officials. Part of the desktop research is probably finding out, does the parish already have an ordinance in place? Are there regulations that govern solar? If so, that's great. Then we know what the rules are, and hopefully we have some certainty about how this project is going to go. If there are no rules in place, which is true in a lot of parishes in the state of Louisiana, then it's going to be kind of a guessing game. And we hope that this first conversation with parish officials is a positive one, and we have some idea of what's going to happen with this project. So as that initial conversation gets started, they're going to be finding out what the rules and regulations are, they're going to be finding out what the reception is, and hopefully finding out who the other important community stakeholders are, who are the other groups that we should be having this conversation with as we get into the community benefits piece and the community input into what this project is going to look like. My fellow panelists talked a little bit about ITEPs and pilots. Those are really common. So the developer might start that discussion if they're going to seek a tax abatement or something like that. And then in addition to that, they might start conversations directly with those community groups about what kind of community benefits the project can provide. So as they're moving through this process, there might be some negotiation, there might be some comparison to what's happened on other solar projects in Louisiana, what's been happening nearby, but there aren't that many examples of that. And so the parish officials and the community groups who are trying to have this negotiation are operating with really limited information. And then in terms of the actual project plan, there's a ton of uncertainty in development, and so developers are typically not going to know the answers to most of your questions about what's going where. What are all of the plans for this project until very late in development when they've done all of their due diligence and they know what this is going to look like. But that also means that those project details are going to be publicized really late and at the place where a lot of design and planning has happened. And that can be really frustrating for community members. And that is inherently tied to the community benefits conversation. So I just want to kind of note where that's often happening in the process. So the reason that a lot of those things are common, I mentioned the lack of local experience. There's just not a lot of examples of this, and most parishes haven't dealt with a utility scale solar project before. So if it's your very first time doing this, understandably, you're operating with a lack of knowledge. There's also not a ton of coordination with the regulation that happens at a state and federal level, and there are a bunch of aspects of these projects that are already regulated by other agencies, but local officials and community members may not be aware of what those regulations are or what the developer is already required to follow. So developers are expected to know all of that. They should come in with that information, but then they're the experts who have to share that information with everybody else who is involved. And there can be some real mistrust there because the developer also has a clear for-profit incentive in all of the information that they're sharing. And so they're expected to be able to know all of that and to share it effectively while being viewed really skeptically by some community members. There's also a lot of lack of context. So we have some good examples of CBAs from other industries, but it can be really hard to know exactly how that might apply to this kind of project because it's just very apples to oranges. We also don't have great examples about outside of a community fund or a straight financial benefit. What else can a developer do for us? And so just not knowing what to ask for on the community side. The developer is also going to have this really significant component that they are already providing pretty significant benefits on most land-based projects, that the taxes and hiring and all of the things that are inherent to that development that are not additional in Matilda's definition are really significant. Sometimes on a several $100 million project, it might be employing 300 skilled trade jobs during construction. And so they are also going to be talking about those benefits and trying to balance the additionalities in that context. And the last piece that I have on here is once opposition does really start to a project, it's really, really difficult to have a good faith negotiation about what the project can provide to the community. Matilda mentioned that folks call it a bribe. It really just undermines any attempt to have a good process and to get to a good outcome. So that's an enormous challenge, and that's a big callback to where I had said this requires political courage. It can be really difficult to navigate that, but somebody has to. Otherwise, we're all going to end up with a bad outcome. So I did want to jump to a couple of examples of things that are non-financial CBA components, just to start giving some ideas of what else can be asked for. Community ownership of a portion of the project can be really significant, and that can be structured a ton of different ways depending on what goals the community is trying to achieve. But if the community knows what it is that they want to get out of that ownership, is it a reduction in our electric bills? Is it that we're seeing some portion of the revenue from this project? That's something that can be brought into the negotiation. Staff time and technical assistance, I think, is a really interesting area here. So one example of a wind project that I worked on, the community identified a really significant gap in local internet access. And the local electric co-op that provided internet to the few hundred rural residents in the area this project was going to be had a last 2 miles problem. They couldn't run fiber optic cable to get internet installed places they need. We have a really high degree of expertise at that developer of getting the easements for that kind of thing. We did it for underground power lines, but we were able to provide technical assistance to that electric co-op so that they could fix their last 2 miles problem. So without a big financial give, still made a really outsized impacts for a few hundred folks who had better internet access. Matilda talked about PLAs. Hiring and workforce commitments don't always have to take the form of a PLA. They can be a CBA component or rolled into a larger agreement. Similar, that can also be rolled into a pilot. And lastly, additional development can go on here. So I think it's a lot more common with renewables to see that additional development be something like conservation land, setting aside a number of acres for a specific use, rather than affordable housing in probably not a very populated area, but that's a really large bucket with a lot of potentially creative solutions to what community priorities are. So I'll jump into the experiment that we're hoping to conduct. This is something that was designed to fix a few of the challenges that I saw while I was negotiating from the side of a developer on this. One is that the lack of trust that I talked about. So our hope is to bring in an independent third party to help mediate and run a process of negotiating a community benefit agreement between community members, community leaders, and a utility scale developer. Our hope is also then to resource community leaders with experts that are not that developer. So I talked about the gap there, that the developer is the only one providing expertise and helping answer questions about how this process should look. So giving them additional resources and access to those. And finally, starting much earlier in the process and trying to do this in a more holistic and inclusive way to gather community input and hopefully get to the outcomes that Matilda talked about that, frankly, we are a little uncertain of how much these are effective at driving right now. So this is a really idealistic process. This is a very rough timeline. So our hope would be to identify projects in early stage development, find out sometimes from developers projects that have not been publicly announced yet, source a locally credible facilitator to play that third-party role, like Center for Planning Excellence, and then match them with expert advisors and resources that are appropriate. That facilitation team goes and meets with community leaders and helps them to design an input process that's appropriate for their community, identifying who the right stakeholders are, who needs to be involved, and how we can generate first broad community input, gather raw data on what folks' needs and priorities are, and then turn those into ultimately a CBA proposal that community leaders can bring to the developers, say, if this project is going to go forward, and we hope it does, here's what we would like to see and how we want to ensure that the entire community benefits from it. And along the way, we also want to test all of these learning objectives. So we want to bake in a really intentional component to measure all of the things that Matilda talked about so that we are getting a real sense of both, is this affecting that ultimate outcome of Are folks more accepting of these projects? Or are they happier about the projects that they end up hosting? And is it increasing our ability to get projects built so that we can hit our clean energy goals and reduce carbon? And do some of these other factors have a real influence? So if folks feel like they had more of a voice in the process, does that matter to the ultimate outcomes? We think so, based on other social science research, but we need to test it and measure it. And also, what terms matter most to that? So are there things that are non-financial that maybe have a much larger influence on how people perceive the ultimate project, more so than the dollar figures? Great question. So there are a few different ways that we're trying to get at that. If we have some ideas, I'm also working with a researcher at UC Berkeley's Possibility Lab to help us do experiment design and make sure that we're being as scientific as we can be on that. But it's still a work in progress, so I'm open to feedback on that, depending on your thoughts and your background in research. I think a few ways that we're hoping that we can measure this. One is by baking in into the surveying or whatever we're doing, kind of in gathering wider community input, that we have some measures within those tools for us to assess how folks feel about the project, and that might be, a multi-round process. So we're going back to some of the same community members who participated in the survey and understanding how they feel about the project and about this process later on as we're communicating out to them what the outcomes of the process has been, what decisions community leaders have made with their input, that kind of thing. Cool. So with that, I'll turn it back to Preston.
Yeah. Max, I'm going to have you stay there because I want to pick up where you left off, if you don't mind. Sure. You're a consultant, which is great because I'm a business person, I've been a lawyer, and I'm thinking about who would your client be here? Is it the community or is it the developer or is it both? And how do you navigate that? And got a couple of other follow-up questions to go with that.
Oh, sure. Well, so in the specific context of the experiments that we're running, thankfully, we have philanthropic support to test out this idea. Yeah. So my client is the philanthropic funder who wants us to help develop a model, hopefully come up with a test case and a proof of concept that this can be really valuable. That won't necessarily be the long-term funding stream. So our hope is to come up with a framework and also a long-term ramp for how communities can maybe more directly access resources for them to be able to do something similar on their own.
Yeah, and I asked that question because is it ever the case where the reverse happens? Instead of the community coming forward and saying, here are the benefits we'd like to get from your development, does it ever happen where the developer says, look, I'd like to hire a consultant or someone because we know that as we go into the community, we'd like to offer the community some benefits and we need some advice about how to do that so that it ends up being win-win?
Yes. Yeah, I'd say that is actually more common in my experience,
Okay.
is for the developer to do something like that. And sometimes that can work really well if the consultant is somebody who knows the community well or is good at community engagement and starts from a place of asking questions and trying to identify community needs. That's where a lot, I think, of those ad hoc benefits or the community funds do come into play, is from somebody having done work like that. And hopefully the community fund does end up being something that's tailored to actual community needs and priorities based on that kind of engagement work. It doesn't reach the level of formality of something like we're talking about here. And sometimes it runs the risk that that consultant or whoever they're engaging with doesn't necessarily represent the entirety of the community. And so you get into real equity questions there.
Great. I'm going to let you take your seat and switch over to Spring. So Spring, you're now with CPACs, and I was interviewed right before this presentation, as we all were. And one of the questions was around CPACs' work over the last 18 years, our impact on the community and the state. And I think about these community benefit plans, the process, the agreements, and how do these CBAs factor into the planning process that might occur here in CPACs' work or across the state in particular? You gave some examples of how the CBAs work in action. Can you expound on that a little bit more?
Oh, of course. And I think Max mentioned like the facilitation aspect is actually a really important concept to have a trusted voice in the community when discussing these projects. CPEX has worked with 75 different communities across the state, so we are a well-known name in Louisiana. We work with our communities, we know what's happening in those communities. So we're able to speak at a level with planners, whether it's zoning codes, land use, what's happening in their communities to see what do you need? What is your community plan? For example, Southwest Louisiana and Lake Charles has their own community plan. So what kind of CBA can we establish with the community plans you have in place that can benefit your community? Getting in on that level, seeing what people need, and be able to facilitate a process to make sure that community, when talking to developers, see the benefits they already have and want and need in their communities.
Yeah. So let me take an example of Amazon came. We are so excited about the fact that Amazon has come and built in a community that needed support. It redeveloped a project. Walk me through how the community might engage and what do you sort of separate what the government would do versus just the regular community? Because we talked about the difference with some sort of tax benefit, but how does that engagement take place, and how do you create that separation of who gets what, if anything, and how do you not ask for too much such that you run the developer off?
That's a very good question. It also goes back to what Tilda was saying. Sometimes it's seen as a bribe from a developer because they're not really engaging with the community, knowing what the community actually wants. It's like they're giving money to a community saying, hey, we think we could use this. The community is like, but what if I wanted something else? What if that's not enough money? What if that's too much money? What are you doing with that? So like for a community, it's really intimidating sometimes to come up to a developer and say, hey, you want this project in my backyard. What am I getting from that? What purpose do I have not to chase you away? So I guess one of the big things a community can do is create a coalition of community leaders, knowing who their trusted voices are, knowing who knows the community best and can get together and talk about that and give each other strength to approach a developer and say, hey, we've all had this discussion together. This is our plan. This is what we want. Let's negotiate and talk. And that's part of the planning process. It may take a long time. People have different views. People think, well, I want to protect this national park, but I want internet access. I think we should have a fund. The things with CBAs is that they take so many different forms. But that flexibility is also incredible when trying to figure out how to best suit it to your community. But yeah. You want to go ahead, Max? Yeah.
Sure.
I
Go
didn't
ahead,
want to
Max.
interrupt, but I was going to add on that I think one of the reasons that we envision this as a really holistic process and kind of negotiating all of these things together is a real challenge for developers in a place where they can sometimes be cagey about what they're willing to commit to or what they're willing to be transparent about, is because if I negotiate one agreement with a specific community organization, then I don't know how many other community organizations are still out there that I'm going to have to negotiate something totally different with. But if they are having that conversation with a kind of whole group of community leaders and can have it in conjunction with, we're seeking this tax abatement, and so we know what our commitment is going to be on that front. We are aware of kind of all of the requests from the community, and we can have a real give and take of saying we can commit to this many of these things, and it's up to community leaders to decide which are the highest priorities that are on that list. Then I think you can get to a better aspect of that negotiation. And the developer, hopefully, if you are really bringing all of the right folks to the table, then can be a little bit more transparent about what they are able to commit to, so you can help answer that question of how much we can ask for.
Exactly. And a lot of things with developers, so that if community is coming to them, they're not sure what that community is going to ask for, how much they want, can they actually provide for the community. But if you have a developer on the front end working with the community, knowing what their skin in the game is, they can have a more holistic and transparent negotiation process.
Yeah, Max, I want to go back to something you said in your presentation, and that is that some developers, one, really don't want any community involvement too early on in the process because a lot of moving parts, a lot of uncertainty, and to add more variables to the development can be problematic? Do you see that more often than not? And that is the community development part doesn't really come in until the latter stages of the development.
I would say it's more common for folks to say we're going to wait to do much public on this project until we have a lot of our ducks in a row. And some of that is for the reason that we want more certainty, right? If we start engagement really early, I might also find out early in our environmental studies, oh, actually there's a big risk here and we're not going to pursue this project. I'm sorry, I got all of you spun up. Goodbye. So that's one element. But there is also for developers who have been burned in the past by starting community engagement really early, sometimes even in a genuine good faith way, and then gotten to my bullet on solar opposition, that some folks just say, we don't want this project. It doesn't matter what you negotiate with us. It doesn't matter what you can come up with to address the individual impacts that we're concerned with. We've just decided we don't want solar. And so the developers can be really concerned that if I start too early, I'm just giving that group of people a lot of time to spread fear and misinformation about the project.
Yeah. Matilda, I'd like to drill down a little bit on a few things that you said. So in your remarks, you said something different than what I read on the internet. So a couple of you talked about the fact that there are different definitions of CBAs, and the one that I read in preparing talked about this being a binding agreement. So as a lawyer, I'm going, oh, binding agreement, I've got some work to do. But then there was a reference to some of these agreements aren't necessarily binding at all. So Matilda, can you give me some examples of where the CBA might not be binding, and are these types sometimes more beneficial than the binding agreements?
Yeah, I would say we've started using a kind of bucket term of just community benefits so that we're not, insinuating that the agreements themselves don't have a legal aspect to them, because they very often are legal contracts. But they sometimes are not, and sometimes are more of like a memorandum of understanding, like an MOU or another kind of form of agreement that parties have agreed to, but just doesn't have that legal backing. An example of that is the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which is an offshore wind port in Brooklyn, New York, where there was an agreement between the developers of the port and the city, and then two community-based environmental justice organizations in that community. That commits to certain workforce development things and port electrification and other things the community really wanted, but as far as I know, doesn't have a legal agreement aspect to it. There are certain things they've done, like set up a $5 million fund for business development, and all of that I'm sure does have that kind of legal standing to make sure they commit to it, but the sort of overall ecosystem of the things they agreed to does not. And so I don't know necessarily whether that's a benefit or not. I don't know why that was the way that they did it, but I think there is flexibility to these things. The things I highlighted, like local, payments to local priorities and programs directly, that might work better in a community where they have distrust of the local government and they don't want the local government receiving funds and deciding where they go. So I think having some of that flexibility and not having to have it always just be one type of agreement and having that be a legally binding agreement could be a good thing.
Yeah. And so MOUs can be binding or non-binding. So what you could do is bring to the table that, look, we could do a binding agreement, but it could be non-binding, and that is, here's some sort of guiding principles, here's what we hope to accomplish. We're not committed as a legal document, but we have an understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish as a community along with the developer. Something else you mentioned, though, Matilda, was the creation of a fund. And that may be an option, that what the developer does is create a fund. Tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe examples of where funds have been created.
Sure. Yeah, we're starting to see that a lot for offshore wind and as well for some land-based wind projects, that they choose to distribute funds annually in that way and have it be sometimes a scholarship fund, sometimes surrounding civic causes or business development, businesses can apply for grants to help with certain things that they need to accomplish. And so that's a way for the community to kind of decide annually or, several times a year where they would like to have funds flow, which I think allows for some flexibility. You can also have it administered by a committee of community members or by a community foundation that already has trust in the community, which can maybe make things be received more positively. One example of this is the Vineyard Wind offshore wind project that's being constructed right now off of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. They have a community fund with the community of Nantucket, and then they also have a tribal benefit fund with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe that's kind of centered around certain things like wastewater projects and language preservation and things that were important to the tribe. So every time I see a new one pop up, it's surrounding different things, so you can kind of tell that it's been customized to the community, which I think is a cool feature.
Great. I can keep asking questions all day, but that wouldn't be fair to the audience. And so I'd like to open it up to the audience, and folks will come around with the microphone and entertain questions.
I think I already know my answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. Do you have any kind of metric on the value of a good value for a CBA? Like specifically, I'm thinking about, like a new plant or something like CapEx or the size of their ITEP or, whatever. Is there a metric that's standard or that you guys feel is a good deal, or is it just kind of you get what you can get,
I can give my perspective on that first. Unfortunately, the answer is no. I don't have any kind of standard for you, and it's because it depends. Is going to be true on just so many individual project factors that it's really hard for me to guess, especially on land-based solar. The margins can be really tight. Transmission is a huge challenge and an enormous cost that can vary really widely from project to project. And so unless I have an idea of what that project's interconnection and network upgrade costs are, or a bunch of other things that the developer is not going to be transparent about, there's no way for me to know. I think I have heard that in oil and gas, there's a metric that's something between 2 and 4% of CapEx might go towards community benefits. I think that percentage would probably be lower by necessity for solar because the margins are just not nearly as high. Oil and gas is way more profitable for those companies. But I think that kind of gives you a benchmark from other industries.
Yeah, and I know with the Salem one, that one was 3% of the project's overall cost, which to me felt like, whoa, like that seems like so, like pretty higher than I would have expected without knowing those numbers before. That's the only one I know the exact number for, but it falls in that 2 to 4. And I would say developers kind of know what they can spend. Like I would like guess that they all have a sort of budget for what they can throw at these things. So it's like, the communities may not get much more than that, but I mean, some of these $100 million kind of things just to have a cable landing pass under the land, it's definitely more than we've seen other communities get. So maybe it's more than a lot of us think it is, that kind of window of what they're able to offer.
Thank you. Boy, informative. This was really good. One quick question for Matilda in terms of the database of community benefit plans that you all have studied and compiled. You mentioned that this goes back several years, certainly before the infrastructure and Justice 40. So I first wondered what kind of studies or examples of projects that are Justice 40 era do you have in your database? And then I have a quick follow-up question.
Okay. So with the community benefit plans, because those just started being required last year, I actually don't know how many projects, how many of those have been filed and where they're being compiled and whether they'll be public. So that would be maybe a question I could get back to you on. I know there's people at the Department of Energy I could ask about that. For our database of community benefit agreements, we are working on publishing that later this year on the Department of Energy's Wind Exchange website. And that will have around 300 or so different examples of community benefit agreements for wind projects. Or I shouldn't say agreements, a lot of them are those foundations and funds and contributions. I would also highlight the Sabin Center at Columbia University has a collection of, looks like you already know about that one, but has a collection of CBAs in different areas beyond just renewable energy. So that's another one.
Okay, and just a very quick follow-up. You mentioned that the research is showing a pattern that the EJ communities are getting shafted to some extent.
Yeah.
So is there any reason to believe, or are you hopeful, any of you, that the Justice 40 new initiatives will somehow level that playing field a little better, or do you expect to see those same power dynamics play out?
Yeah, I would hope to see that the community benefit plans help kind of close that gap, since it is like if you wanted a production tax credit or any other amount of government funding, you will need to do a good job of explaining the benefits. I think one issue I could potentially see is that often workforce development is where the benefits for those types of communities get centered. So especially with the port projects for offshore wind, and I know I didn't explain that, so anybody unfamiliar with offshore wind, the components are very large. They have to be built at ports and then towed out to seas. So we're seeing port development for that purpose, and here in Louisiana as well. Those communities are getting offered, things like jobs and workforce development. Not always guaranteed that jobs will go to the people that live there. So it's not necessarily even a benefit, but instead of a CBA. So my concern would be we'll continue to see this pattern where communities that don't really need the extra money are getting offered $100 million. And then communities that could use that money are instead just being this nebulous offer of jobs, which could have some inequities to it.
I'm going to list.
Go ahead, Spring.
And as we heard at Petracucho last night, you cannot replace what you displace. So a lot we have to look at with community benefit agreements in particular is local hiring practices and making sure our locals are getting the jobs in their local communities.
I was just going to add a note, particularly on the power dynamics involved. So many of these projects they are regulated and approved at a parish level. And so whatever power dynamics are playing out in all of the other decisions that are being made at a parish level that are probably marginalizing certain groups are going to continue to do so if that's the structure in place, and that's who the developers are very actively incentivized to say that's who we need to negotiate with, that's who we need to believe that we've done a good job of community engagement. So I'll take off my developer hat and put my grassroots organizer hat on and say, organize, change power dynamics in your community.
I had a somewhat related question to the last one, and also your kind of case study you were talking about of an Amazon warehouse, I think you were saying earlier. So I work in California for environmental justice groups. We've actually been trying to help them around some of the big warehousing going on in the Central Valley. And what I found really interesting is I'm more of coming from the environmental engineering standpoint, so I don't really know the CBA process. But what seemed strange to me is there's obviously the job stuff seems clearer, right? Did we meet this many jobs? Did we bring them to the community? The harder part is around the environmental exposures and the impacts. And I don't even just mean the air and noise and those impacts, but even just on roads, so that was a big issue in that community. It was well, how much should they pay for the roads, and should it be more than their taxes because they're destroying them more? And then obviously the more nebulous stuff like air pollution and things like that. And so we've been working on how to route trucking to them to minimize impacts. But I'm kind of curious, seems a lot of the CBAs are kind of random. It's here's $500,000 or $1 million for this daycare, and maybe that's what the community wants, but shouldn't it seem to start from the NEPA or CEQA impacts and then say what is my air pollution impact? How am I going to mitigate that, and how much does it cost? And it seems like a lot of the benefits agreements aren't linked to those real issues, and so I was just curious how you guys are navigating that kind of thing and really trying to first tackle what are your impacts before random other benefits.
I just want to say that sometimes it's not as random as you think. Particularly if you're looking at low-income communities, childcare is a major thing because if you don't have people taking care of your children, how are you supposed to get a job? And making sure that your children are living in an environment they can breathe in. Which for us in Louisiana, we know that 52% of our population live in LMI communities. There are disadvantaged tracts in every parish in our state. So looking to see what the community actually wants and needs. It's also an environmental factor. You're correct. Air pollution is a major problem in Louisiana. An example I was talking about earlier is the Hollywood and Highland. That's extra traffic going through that area. What are the environmental impacts of that? That actually was studied when trying to figure out what would those community benefits be and trying to figure out decrease traffic flow, mitigate environmental impacts. And there are actually some plans like protecting national parks or conservation funding to help sustain environments. So my background is environmental law, so I'm making sure that things are also considered when looking at CBAs. I see you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add that at least in the renewable energy context, the environmental impact of the projects would typically be more like a conservation sort of thing. If you were displacing some amount of ecosystem for things, you're not seeing the air quality problems you would be seeing with Amazon and things like that. The reason I did highlight the ports is that it's not true for the ports. The ports, you're absolutely that's a very unhealthy thing to live near, and so that's the specific research interest of mine is the offshore wind port development and how certain things are being done to make sure that those are not just introducing pollutants and noise and light pollution and water pollution, all these things into the communities without mitigating it at all. But one other thing I would say why you're not seeing environmental impact stuff show up as much in a CBA is that CBAs are actually not related to NEPA. So like the impact analysis that would be doing in that and figuring out what you're required to mitigate, those would be required mitigations. So like if you're impacting a certain ecosystem and then the NEPA analysis says you have to do certain things, that doesn't fall under what would typically be in a CBA. So it's kind of like CBA is typically more about the community and less about the impacts of the project that can be mitigated through federal or state laws.
But the community is really focused on mitigating those impacts. If it's environmental justice communities and that coalition talking to the developer, then that's their front line. So to make sure those are actually part of the CBA.
Great. One more question. Got time for one more.
Okay, thank you so much for speaking with us today and kind of informing us about this topic. My question is, it had been mentioned that Europe kind of has like a longer history of putting these into practice. And so I was wondering, do they have any sort of standards that they are following that we are able as the United States to kind of piggyback on? And are we how are we researching this to try to get a best practice established here? Because it sounds these are very fluid in nature. And so it's hard to say, well, what is, to everyone's point, what should be in these documents? How do we actually measure what the both short and long-term benefit will be to the community, and how do we properly go back to the to the developer and say, hey, yes, we like this, or no, we don't, based upon these other factors. And then my second question, and I'm sorry, it's two, is, are you guys developing any sort of best practice in addition to the database that you're compiling with the examples? Will there be guidance on how to properly vet some of these CBAs? Thank you.
Yeah, with the European context, and I actually was talking about this week at the IPF Offshore Wind Conference in New Orleans about the different approaches to standardizing, because that's something that people in offshore wind are really interested in, is standardizing. I think part of the problems with when you standardize and require is that you start to see it not be as effective, because once something's a required benefit, then people do not tend to perceive it as being as positive and making them want to support a project. So that's a challenge. But one option would be to require it but not standardize it. So you could say like you must have, and that's what some states have done, say you must have a certain benefit of $4,000 per turbine for wind. But then you can kind of do whatever you want beyond that. And then the other option would be to standardize but not require, and that is what they've done in some parts of Europe. So there is a community benefit protocol in the UK that is basically saying like, all of these developers have kind of decided this is our standard for it. The government is backing it, but it's not actually legally required. And so that's a little bit easier way to overcome some of the issues we'd have in the US about doing that on the federal level, especially for things like land-based wind and solar, which are sited locally or at the state, not federal, unlike offshore wind. So it would be like very hard to set that standard. In terms of the best practices, that is something that my national lab and the Department of Energy are working on a kind of approach to that with NGOs and universities, everyone else that's working on this topic, to kind of bring everyone together to talk about best practices, at least for energy. But to do it across industries, across Amazon warehouses and everything like that, I think would be a more difficult challenge.
I love this panel. They can just go on, and this is a wonderful topic. Ladies and gentlemen, we run out of time, and I want to say a couple things. One, if you're looking for professional continuing education, go to the table in the foyer. I want you to join me in giving these wonderful panelists a round of applause. This has been a wonderful, not only panel, but summit. This concludes our summit activities. As I said earlier, 18 years of doing this is hard to believe. The summit has been a wonderful event and opportunity for businesses, for community leaders, advocates to come together. Every year I come, I learn, I'm inspired, I'm energized, and I see the nodding heads in the audience, and I know that you are too. And we look forward to having you back in the future and the continuing conversation that we're going to have over the next several months. So again, to our panelists, thank you. To our audience, thank you as well, and have a great day and a wonderful weekend.
And thank you for Tristan for moderating.
Yeah. Ooh. Thank you.